If you are listening to this chronicle, leave a mark of your presence by writing the city you listen from, wherever in the realms or beyond you may be. If these ancient truths speak to you, consider binding yourself to this archive so more forbidden pages may be opened. Now let us begin where even gods are subject to law. Before there were temples, before prayer had a language, before mortals could name the sky above them, there was order without form. In the forgotten realms, the first truth is not a god, but a boundary. That boundary is Ao. Ao is not worshipped, not invoked, and not recorded in mortal scripture by accident. His role is not to rule the cosmos in the manner of kings or creators, but to define what rule itself means. In the earliest cosmologies preserved by planar scholars and confirmed through divine catastrophe, Io existed as the overgod of realm space, detached, absolute, and unmoved by devotion. He did not create the gods as one might fashion tools. He established the conditions under which gods could exist at all. This distinction matters. It is the difference between authorship and governance. Io did not shape Toril with his hands, nor breathe life into the plains through will alone. Instead, he imposed structure, laws that even divinity could not ignore. Power within this system required limitation. Existence demanded balance. Without these constraints, creation would not have endured long enough for history to begin. When realm space coalesced, when Aber Toril took form within the greater multiverse, the first gods emerged alongside it, not after it. They were not born from mortal belief, for mortals did not yet exist, nor were they unified by purpose or shared origin. Each arose as an expression of a fundamental principle embedded in the fabric of reality itself: light and darkness, growth and decay, preservation and entropy. None were whole on their own, and none could exist in isolation without destabilizing what had just come into being. At this stage, the gods were not a pantheon. They were forces given awareness. The earliest divine presences did not see themselves as siblings or rivals. They acted according to their nature, shaping the nascent world in ways that reflected their portfolios, even before such roles had names. Mountains rose where endurance dominated. Seas spread where change demanded motion. Time itself became a current rather than a point, because no single god could contain it. Yet from the beginning, friction was inevitable. When one divine will imposed permanence, another introduced transformation. When one sought illumination, another expanded shadow. These were not acts of malice, but of incompatibility. Each god acted correctly according to its nature, and that correctness threatened the whole. This is where Ao's law first became visible in consequence rather than concept. Unchecked divine action began to strain the structure of realm space. Reality did not resist through armies or disasters, but through instability. Creations unraveled, form dissolved. What one god built, another inadvertently erased. In this imbalance, a silent truth asserted itself. No god, regardless of power, could dominate the whole without destroying the system that sustained them. This realization did not come through revelation. It came through failure. For the first time, divine beings encountered a limit not imposed by another god, but by existence itself. Their power was vast, but conditional. Their survival depended on coherence. In this moment, hierarchy began, not as a throne or title, but as an understanding. Some gods adapted, others resisted. Those who could not restrain their nature were diminished, their influence curtailed not by punishment, but by irrelevance. Ao did not intervene with judgment. He did not speak. The law was already in place. As the world stabilized, life emerged, not by divine decree, but as a consequence of equilibrium. Mortals were not created to serve the gods. They arose because the conditions of the world finally allowed complexity to persist. This development, subtle at first, would become the most transformative factor in divine history. The gods noticed belief, not worship as ritual, but awareness as connection. Mortals named what they feared. They remembered what aided them. They told stories. In doing so, they anchored divine concepts into narrative and symbol. Power that had once flowed only from cosmic principle now found reinforcement through mortal minds. This was not anticipated. It was discovered. Some gods resisted this bond, seeing it as dilution. Others embraced it, sensing opportunity. For the first time, divinity became relational. Gods could weaken if forgotten. They could strengthen if remembered. Existence, once purely structural, now had witnesses. With this shift, divine behavior changed. Actions began to account for perception. Conflicts became measured. Alliances formed, not from affection, but from necessity. If reality collapsed, belief would vanish. If belief vanished, so would the gods who depended on it. Thus, without proclamation or ceremony, the first pantheon began to take shape. Not a family, not a council, a balance. And in that balance, a deeper truth settled into place. The gods were no longer just expressions of reality. They were participants within it. The recognition that belief could sustain divinity did not immediately unify the gods. It clarified them. Once mortal awareness entered the equation, divine existence acquired weight, consequence, and risk. A god who shaped too violently risked erasing the very minds that anchored its power. A god who withdrew entirely risked fading into abstraction. Balance was no longer theoretical. It became necessary for survival. This necessity reshaped divine interaction. The earliest gods began to observe one another, not as rivals to be destroyed, but as variables that could destabilize the whole if left unchecked. Conflict did not vanish, but it slowed. It became calculated. When clashes occurred, they were contained, not by mercy, but by an emerging understanding that annihilation was inefficient. From this restraint emerged the first divine alignments. These were not moral alliances, they were functional ones. Gods whose portfolios complemented one another discovered that cooperation produced stability where dominance failed. Deities associated with creation, continuity, and knowledge found common ground, not because they agreed, but because their coexistence preserved the conditions under which they all endured. Preservation without growth stagnated reality. Growth without preservation destroyed it. Knowledge without structure unraveled meaning itself. In contrast, gods whose natures opposed coherence, those embodying unchecked destruction, absolute entropy, or oblivion, found themselves increasingly isolated. Their influence did not disappear, but it became constrained by the simple truth that too much dissolution threatened the system that allowed them to exist at all. This was the beginning of hierarchy, though no god yet claimed authority over another. Hierarchy formed through consequence. Gods who adapted to limitation endured. Gods who refused were diminished. Some retreated beyond the immediate shaping of Teril. Others fractured, their influence dispersing into lesser manifestations. Canon records do not always name these early losses, but their absence is itself evidence of the system at work. The pantheon did not grow solely through creation. It grew through subtraction. As mortal societies developed, patterns of worship emerged organically. Mortals did not understand the cosmic stakes. They honored what aided survival. They feared what threatened it. Over time, these instincts crystallized into myths, symbols, and rituals. The gods observed something unexpected. Belief did not merely reflect divine power, it refined it. A god known only as a force remained diffuse, a god understood as a protector, a judge, a keeper of cycles gained clarity. Portfolios sharpened, identities stabilized. The gods began to recognize themselves through the lens of mortal perception. This refinement carried a cost. Divine action now echoed back through belief. A god's failures were remembered. Its contradictions were debated. Its absence was noticed. Divinity became visible, and visibility invited consequence. It is here that the notion of a pantheon becomes meaningful. The pantheon was not a governing body, but a shared condition. The gods understood that their actions affected not only reality, but each other's survival. An imbalance introduced by one would be corrected by many, not out of loyalty, but necessity. Informal compacts formed. Boundaries were respected. When conflict occurred, it was increasingly channeled through proxies, symbols, and influence rather than direct reality-breaking force. Io remained silent throughout this transformation. His absence was not neglect, it was confirmation. The system functioned because it adhered to the laws he established. Gods who pushed too far encountered limits they could not cross. Those who tested the structure learned that Ao's authority did not need constant enforcement to be absolute. This realization altered divine ambition. The gods ceased striving for total dominion over existence. Instead, they sought dominance within domains. Portfolios became territories. Influence became strategy. The cosmic struggle narrowed from creation itself to interpretation of role. By the end of this era, the gods were no longer raw manifestations of principle. They were defined entities with histories, constraints, and relationships shaped by mutual dependence. The pantheon did not emerge because the gods desired unity. It emerged because reality demanded coordination. The truth revealed by this stage is subtle but decisive. The pantheon was not born from harmony. It was born from limitation. Once limitation became understood, conflict changed its nature. But it did not disappear. The gods were now aware that direct confrontation carried risks not only to their rivals, but to the structure that sustained them all. Yet divine nature cannot simply be set aside. Portfolios compel action, just as gravity compels motion. The question was no longer whether the gods would clash, but how. In the earliest recorded divine struggles, there is a notable absence of total war. Instead, power was tested through pressure. One god's influence would expand subtly, reshaping climates, altering cycles, or nudging the development of mortal cultures. Another would respond not with annihilation, but with correction, counterbalancing forces that restored equilibrium without unraveling reality. These were not peaceful acts. They were controlled ones. This shift marked the first true transformation of divine conflict into divine politics. Gods began to recognize patterns. When imbalance emerged, it often followed predictable paths. Excessive creation led to stagnation. Unchecked decay led to emptiness. Knowledge without restraint bred paradox. Over time, gods whose domains repeatedly destabilized the world found themselves opposed not by a single rival, but by several acting in convergence. No decree was issued. No alliance was announced. The correction simply occurred. From this process emerged a quiet hierarchy of influence. Some gods proved essential to maintaining continuity. Others proved disruptive unless constrained. This did not imply moral judgment. it reflected function. Deities whose portfolios aligned with continuity, such as cycles, memory, growth, and ordered change, became central nodes in the emerging divine network. Those aligned with absolute negation or domination remained powerful, but peripheral, acting at the edges rather than the core. It is important to understand that this hierarchy was never formalized. There was no first among equals, no throne at the center of creation. Io's law forbade such concentration of authority. Any god who attempted to rise above the system itself would inevitably threaten balance, and would be corrected by it. This understanding produced the first true boundaries between gods, not physical borders, but conceptual ones. Domains became defined not only by what a god governed, but by what it did not. Encroachment carried consequence. When a god pushed beyond its domain, it invited resistance not as punishment, but as systemic response. The pantheon began to behave like an ecosystem, where overreach triggered correction. Mortals, unaware of these dynamics, interpreted the results as mythic struggles, storms against cities, plagues following hubris, boons granted to one culture and withdrawn from another. In truth, these were surface expressions of deeper adjustments occurring at the divine level. The gods were learning restraint, not from compassion, but from experience. At the center of this evolving order stood Io's silence. There is no canonical record of Io issuing commands during this era. No visions, no proclamations. Yet his presence was felt precisely because boundaries held. Gods who tested them found no loopholes. Those who attempted to act as creators of creation itself failed, not spectacularly, but definitively. Their influence diminished. Their names faded. Some survived only as echoes, remembered in fragmented myths without worship strong enough to restore them. This period also revealed a critical truth about divinity. Godhood was not static. Power could be lost. Influence could wane. A god who failed to adapt to the realities of belief, limitation, and balance risked irrelevance. Conversely, beings who learned to operate within the system could endure, and even grow. The pantheon was not closed. It was selective. By the end of this phase, divine existence had changed irrevocably. Gods were no longer solitary forces acting upon reality from outside. They were interdependent participants within it, constrained by law, shaped by belief, and corrected by consequence. The world endured not because the gods agreed, but because none of them could afford to break it. With restraint established among the gods, the focus of divine power shifted downward, to the world itself. Mortals were no longer incidental outcomes of cosmic balance. They had become the medium through which divine influence stabilized, spread, or withered. This was not immediately understood by all gods, but its effects were unmistakable. As mortal societies grew more complex, patterns of devotion began to solidify. Worship was no longer instinctive alone. It became cultural. Stories were preserved, rituals repeated, names spoken across generations acquired weight. In this repetition, gods found continuity. In neglect, they found erosion. Divinity, once anchored solely in cosmic principle, now depended in part on memory. This dependency altered divine priorities. Gods began to invest in mortals not as servants, but as stabilizers. Guidance replaced domination. Inspiration replaced imposition. A god whose presence aligned with mortal needs found its influence clarified and reinforced. One whose nature clashed constantly with survival found its worship fragmented, fearful, or short-lived. The gods did not become benevolent, but they became attentive. Around this time, The distinction between greater and lesser gods began to emerge. This distinction was not determined by age or raw power, but by resilience within the system. Gods with broad, essential portfolios, those tied to forces mortals could not avoid, such as time, death, magic, or nature, proved difficult to diminish. Their worship diversified across cultures and eras. Gods with narrow or extreme domains depended on specific conditions to endure. When those conditions vanished, so did much of their strength. This stratification was not imposed. It was observed. The pantheon, still informal, now possessed internal gravity. Some gods drew others into alignment simply by existing at the center of mortal experience. Others orbited at a distance, influential only where circumstances allowed. Conflict continued, but its stakes changed. Victory was no longer measured by destruction, but by relevance. At the midpoint of this era came a subtle but decisive realization. Belief did not merely empower gods, it constrained them. A god known as a protector could not easily become a tyrant without fracturing its worship. A god revered for balance could not embrace chaos without contradiction. Mortals, through expectation and narrative, shaped divine behavior as surely as gods shaped mortal fate. This feedback loop stabilized the pantheon more effectively than any decree. Some gods resisted this shaping. They sought to redefine themselves through force, demanding fear over reverence. The results were consistent. Fear produced devotion, but rarely loyalty. When fear waned, worship collapsed. Gods who relied solely on terror found themselves powerful in moments, weak across generations. Others adapted. They refined their domains, embraced symbols, and accepted limitation as identity rather than restriction. These gods endured. Throughout this transformation, Ao remained absent, but not irrelevant. The system held because his laws allowed no exception. Gods could evolve, but not escape structure. Attempts to sever the link between belief and power failed. Attempts to dominate all domains failed. The boundaries that defined divinity proved absolute not because Ao enforced them constantly, but because they were foundational. By the close of this period, the pantheon was no longer accidental. It was recognizable. Gods were known by name, by role, by expectation. Mortals could pray with intent. Divine influence followed patterns. The chaos of early divinity had given way to a precarious order, one not built on peace, but on mutual dependence. The truth revealed here is quiet, but profound. The gods did not merely shape mortals. They were, in turn, shaped by them. The pantheon did not solidify through agreement, but through necessity sharpened by repetition. As gods adapted to belief and limitation, patterns of cooperation emerged that went beyond temporary alignment. Certain deities found that their domains reinforced one another so consistently that separation became inefficient. Creation required preservation. Knowledge required continuity. Cycles required memory. These relationships were not philosophical, they were structural. From these recurring intersections arose the first enduring divine compacts. These compacts were never written, never sworn, and never enforced by authority. They existed as mutual understanding. A god who violated them did not face judgment, but consequence. Interference in another's domain triggered resistance that echoed back through belief, myth, and mortal reaction. Over time, gods learned where pressure could be applied, and where it could not, without destabilizing the whole. This marked a crucial evolution. The gods began to govern themselves, not through morality or shared vision, but through survival logic. The pantheon became self-regulating. When imbalance emerged, it was corrected not by Io's intervention, but by divine response operating within his laws. Io had not created rulers. He had created a system that forced restraint. It is here that the idea of first among gods must be addressed and dismissed. No god rose to supreme authority within the pantheon. Any attempt to centralize divine power would have replicated the instability of the earliest era. Instead, influence flowed contextually. In matters of magic, the gods tied to arcane law carried weight. In matters of death, those bound to endings shaped outcome. Authority shifted depending on the domain involved. Power was situational, not absolute. This fluid authority prevented stagnation. At the same time, it exposed vulnerability. Gods who depended heavily on specific cultures or epochs found themselves threatened by change. As civilizations rose and fell, so too did the prominence of their patrons. Some gods responded by broadening their domains, reframing themselves to remain relevant. Others clung to narrow identities and faded as their worship vanished. Canonical histories record these losses indirectly. A god disappears from prayers. A symbol loses meaning. A name survives only in fragmentary myth. These were not executions. They were obsolescence. Yet loss also created opportunity. As divine power waned in one place, it could be claimed in another. Beings of sufficient power, primordial entities, powerful outsiders, even mortals, could ascend by filling vacuums left behind. Ascension was rare, difficult, and never guaranteed, but it was possible. The pantheon was not sealed, it was dynamic. This dynamism introduced a new tension. The gods were no longer the only candidates for godhood. The implications were profound. Divinity was not a fixed class. It was a state achievable under specific conditions, within strict limits. Io's law did not forbid ascent. It regulated it. Any being who rose to godhood inherited the same constraints, the same dependencies, and the same risks. Thus, the pantheon expanded not only by endurance, but by replacement. This reality further discouraged reckless divine behavior. A god who overreached could be weakened. A weakened god could be supplanted. Survival now required adaptability, relevance, and restraint. Even ancient gods were not immune to this pressure. Mortals, once passive recipients of divine influence, had become active participants in cosmic equilibrium. Through belief, through myth, through memory, they reinforced some gods and eroded others. They did not control the pantheon, but they shaped its composition. The gods could inspire, guide, or terrify, but they could not force permanence. Throughout all of this, Io remained unchanged. There is no record of him objecting to ascensions, losses, or reconfigurations. The system functioned as designed. Gods came and went. Balance held. Reality endured. The truth revealed by this phase is unsettling in its clarity. The pantheon was not sacred because it was eternal. It was stable because it was replaceable. There came a moment when the self-regulation of the pantheon proved insufficient. Not because the gods had grown careless, but because the system itself was tested at its limits. Divine maneuvering, restrained though it had become, still accumulated pressure. Portfolios overlapped. Influence spread unevenly. The balance held, but it strained. This was the moment Io acted. Canonical records do not describe his arrival as a descent or manifestation. There was no form, no voice carried on wind or flame. Io's intervention is known only through its effects. Boundaries that had once been inferred became absolute. Laws that had been understood implicitly were made unavoidable. The gods learned, in a single corrective act, that there were lines not even collective divinity could cross. This intervention did not destroy gods. It redefined them. Io established cosmic limits that no divine being could bypass. Gods would no longer walk the world freely without consequence. Their power would be mediated. Their direct interference would be constrained. The gods were not stripped of influence, but of immediacy. From this point forward, their presence in the mortal realm would be indirect, channeled through avatars, chosen servants, visions, and symbols. This was not punishment. It was stabilization. The impact on the Pantheon was immediate and lasting. Divine conflict could no longer resolve itself through raw force in the material world. The risk of reality damage was removed by removing the gods themselves from unrestricted access. Influence shifted decisively toward subtlety. Strategy replaced dominance. Faith replaced fear as the primary conduit of power. In enforcing these limits, Io clarified a truth the gods could no longer ignore. They were custodians, not owners, of reality. This clarification restructured divine ambition. Gods who had once sought supremacy adjusted their aims toward depth rather than breadth. Mastery of a domain became more valuable than expansion into others. Precision replaced excess. The Pantheon did not shrink, but it stabilized into a more predictable configuration. At the midpoint of this transformation, a deeper implication emerged. If Io could impose such limits once, he could do so again. The gods understood that their autonomy existed only within tolerance. Io was not absent. He was observant. His silence was conditional. This awareness did more to enforce restraint than any repeated intervention could have. The gods internalized the boundaries because violating them carried existential risk. Mortals felt the effects without understanding the cause. Miracles became rarer, but more focused. Divine manifestations became symbolic rather than overwhelming. Faith became interpretive rather than reactive. The age of gods as visible forces faded, replaced by an age of belief as the primary connection between mortal and divine. The Pantheon adapted quickly because it had to. Those gods who relied on spectacle weakened. Those who understood symbolism endured. A whispered prayer now carried more weight than a thunderous appearance ever had. Divinity, once measured in force, was now measured in persistence. Io withdrew once more, if he had ever truly arrived. But the system he reinforced endured. The gods did not rebel, they recalibrated. They had learned the final lesson of early divinity. Power without restraint invites correction, and correction, when it comes, is absolute. From this point onward, the Pantheon would exist not merely as a balance of forces, but as a governed order, silent, constrained, and enduring. With Io's boundaries now undeniable, the nature of godhood settled into a more rigid shape. What had once been fluid expressions of cosmic principle became defined identities, each constrained by role, expectation, and limitation. The age of improvisational divinity ended. In its place rose structure. This was the era in which portfolios hardened. A god was no longer simply associated with an aspect of reality. It was bound to it. Death was not an influence to be shared casually. Magic was not a force to be borrowed freely. Nature was not an abstraction, but a domain with edges and consequence. When overlap occurred, it was negotiated implicitly through balance rather than seized by force. The gods learned that clarity preserved power, while ambiguity invited erosion. As portfolios crystallized, so did divine personalities. Gods became consistent not because they wished to be understood, but because inconsistency fractured belief. A god of law who acted chaotically weakened itself. A god of renewal who clung to permanence lost relevance. Mortal expectation, now deeply woven into divine endurance, rewarded coherence and punished contradiction. Identity became survival. This coherence gave rise to recognizable divine relationships. Rivalries emerged where domains pressed against one another. Partnerships formed where cycles depended on cooperation. These relationships were not emotional in the mortal sense, but they were persistent. Over time, they solidified into the familiar tensions and alignments recorded in later myths and theological traditions. The pantheon became legible. At the center of this transformation lay a subtle but powerful anchor. The gods began to remember. Not memory as mortals experience it, but continuity of self across eras. Early divinity had been reactive, shaped moment by cosmic pressure. Now gods possessed histories. They carried the consequences of earlier actions forward. Reputation mattered, not only among mortals, but among gods. A god who violated boundaries or destabilized balance found cooperation harder to secure in the future. Trust, rare as it was, became valuable. This was also the period when divine symbols gained enduring form. Holy icons, sacred animals, recurring imagery. These were not arbitrary. They were stabilizers, reinforcing identity across cultures and centuries. Through symbol, a god could remain recognizable even as languages changed and civilizations fell. The pantheon learned to persist through representation. Midway through this era, a critical shift occurred. The gods ceased to see mortals merely as conduits of belief and began to see them as instruments of balance. Chosen servants, prophets, and champions emerged not to spread chaos, but to localize divine influence. Rather than act directly, gods acted through individuals whose lives could absorb consequence without unraveling reality. This delegation was not mercy. It was efficiency. Mortals could fail without destabilizing the cosmos. Through them, divine will became precise. This precision further reduced the need for overt divine conflict. Disputes played out through cultures, philosophies, and values rather than cataclysm. The world became the arena, not the casualty, of divine interaction. History, from this point onward, became meaningful in a new way. It mattered to the gods. Io did not respond to these developments because they aligned perfectly with his design. The pantheon had become what it was always meant to be: powerful, constrained, self-regulating, and dependent on the world it influenced. Gods were no longer forces acting upon reality from above. They were embedded within it, bound by law, memory, and consequence. The truth revealed in this phase is foundational. Divinity endured not by escaping limitation, but by accepting definition. As divine roles hardened and relationships stabilized, the pantheon entered a phase of expansion that was neither chaotic nor benevolent. It was selective. The structure Io had enforced did not prevent growth. It filtered it. New gods could emerge, but only if they fit within the system without destabilizing it. This is the era in which ascension became historically visible. Some beings rose through accumulation, gathering worship, influence, and myth until their presence crossed a threshold. Others inherited fragments of fallen power, absorbing abandoned portfolios left behind by diminished gods. In each case, the result was the same. Ascended divinity was bound immediately by the same laws as the oldest gods. No exemption existed for novelty. Ascension did not elevate a being above the pantheon. It inserted them into it. This insertion was rarely smooth. New gods disrupted equilibrium simply by existing. Their domains overlapped imperfectly. Their myths competed for belief. The pantheon responded not with rejection, but with pressure. Boundaries formed quickly, portfolios narrowed, excess ambition was corrected through resistance rather than decree. Those who adapted survived. Those who did not faded or fractured. Not all expansions were voluntary. Some gods absorbed rivals through conflict or consolidation, integrating domains rather than erasing them. This was not annihilation, but reconfiguration. Power did not vanish. It changed hands. The pantheon remained numerically flexible but structurally stable. Growth occurred, but always at the cost of complexity. This period also clarified a harsh truth. Divinity could be lost. A god whose worship collapsed did not immediately cease to exist, but existence without relevance proved unsustainable. Such beings became vestigial, lingering in obscurity, unable to exert meaningful influence. Over time, even their names eroded. What remained were echoes in forgotten rituals, half-remembered symbols, and obscure myths whose origins no longer aligned with any living power. The pantheon did not mourn these losses. It adjusted. At the midpoint of this era, the system revealed its most unsettling feature. Replacement was not a failure of order, but a function of it. The pantheon remained balanced precisely because it could change. Stability did not require permanence. It required adaptability within constraint. Mortals played a decisive role in this process. Cultural shifts redirected belief. New values elevated new domains. Old fears lost urgency. Through this slow, collective movement, mortals reshaped the divine landscape without ever commanding it. The gods could guide belief, but they could not freeze it. Time, culture, and memory remained beyond divine control. This reality encouraged caution among established gods. Power was no longer measured solely by magnitude, but by resilience across eras. A god tied too tightly to a single age risked extinction when that age ended. Those who endured learned to anchor themselves to constants: death, change, knowledge, nature, conflict. These domains persisted regardless of civilization. Io's law held firm throughout these transitions. No ascended god bypassed the system. No fallen god was restored without consequence. The rules applied uniformly, without preference for age or origin. The pantheon's expansion did not weaken order, it demonstrated it. The truth revealed here is stark. The gods were not eternal fixtures of reality. They were occupants. And occupancy, within Io's design, was always conditional. With expansion filtered and loss normalized, the pantheon entered its most enduring phase: equilibrium through opposition. Gods no longer needed constant correction from outside forces, because internal tensions now served that role. Rivalries hardened into predictable patterns. Compacts became customary. The divine order learned how to persist without stillness. This self-regulation did not imply peace. Gods continued to compete, for influence, for relevance, for the shape of mortal belief, but competition followed boundaries. Conflict became iterative rather than catastrophic. Where once a clash might have torn at the foundations of reality, it now expressed itself through long arcs of influence. Shifting cultures, changing moral frameworks, cycles of rise and decline. The gods learned patience, because patience preserved power. From this dynamic emerged a quiet governance. There was no council that ruled the pantheon, no throne that commanded it. Instead, balance was enforced by convergence. When a god pressed too far beyond its domain, opposition did not come from a single rival. but from many whose interests aligned against disruption. The correction was distributed. Responsibility was shared. No god could claim innocence, and none could claim dominion. This distributed balance proved resilient. It also clarified the limits of divine will. Gods could influence outcomes, but not dictate history. They could inspire conquest, but not guarantee victory. They could foster belief, but not control interpretation. Mortals remained unpredictable, and that unpredictability acted as a stabilizing force. Too much divine interference narrowed possibility. Too little risked irrelevance. The Pantheon learned to exist in tension with the world, not above it. Midway through this era, a defining realization settled among the gods. The system did not exist to serve them. They existed to operate within it. Io's design revealed itself not as a hierarchy with gods at its peak, but as a framework in which gods were powerful variables, not final authorities. The planes endured regardless of which gods held prominence. Realm space remained intact despite divine turnover. The multiverse did not depend on any single deity, only on balance. This understanding altered divine strategy at its core. Gods ceased attempting to rewrite the system and focused instead on interpretation. Influence became narrative. Power flowed through meaning rather than force. Myths grew layered, capable of adaptation without collapse. A god whose story could be told in many ways endured longer than one bound to a single rigid interpretation. Symbols mattered more than miracles. As a result, the Pantheon became increasingly abstract in its methods. Direct intervention was rare and deliberate. The consequences of action were considered across centuries rather than moments. Divine patience was not virtue, it was survival. This period also marked the full integration of divine law into mortal theology. Clerics, scholars, and philosophers began to articulate patterns that reflected the true structure of the Pantheon. Limits on divine action, consistency of domain, consequences for overreach. These were not revelations from gods, but observations drawn from history. Mortals learned the rules by watching them enforced. The gods could not undo this knowledge. Once understood, structure could not be unseen. The divine order became predictable enough to be studied, yet complex enough to resist mastery. Faith did not diminish. It matured. Worship adapted to expectation. The Pantheon responded by reinforcing coherence. Through all of this, Io remained distant. There is no record of further intervention during this era because none was required. The system functioned. The gods obeyed not because they were compelled moment to moment, but because the cost of violation was already known. Io's authority had become environmental, present in consequence rather than command. By the close of this phase, the Pantheon was no longer forming. It was enduring. Gods rose and fell within it. Beliefs shifted. Cultures vanished. Yet the structure persisted, absorbing change without collapse. The divine order had become a constant, not because it was unchanging, but because it could change without breaking. The truth revealed here is definitive. The Pantheon did not survive because the gods were powerful. It survived because power was restrained by design. By the dawn of recorded history, the Pantheon no longer resembled its origins. What began as uncoordinated divine forces had become a structured, enduring order, recognizable, predictable, and constrained. Mortals encountered the gods not as raw powers shaping reality directly, but as defined presences acting through faith, symbol, and consequence. This transformation marked the true birth of the Pantheon as history knows it. The gods were now participants within a larger design, not its authors. Each operated within a portfolio that granted influence while imposing limit. No god stood above the others. No god stood above the system. Even those revered as creators, judges, or preservers remained subject to the same laws that governed loss, relevance, and balance. Io's role, often misunderstood, is clarified fully only at this point. He was never the architect of worship, nor the sculptor of divine identity. He was the guarantor of structure. His authority defined the frame within which divinity could exist without unraveling the multiverse. The gods did not obey Ao out of loyalty or fear. They obeyed because existence itself functioned according to the rules he set. Within this framework, the pantheon found permanence not through stasis, but through process. Gods could rise. Gods could fall. Portfolios could shift. Worship could fade or flourish. None of this threatened reality so long as balance held. The system absorbed change the way the world absorbs seasons. Loss followed by renewal. Erosion followed by formation. The pantheon endured because it was designed to adapt. For mortals, this meant that the gods were never absolute truths, but living forces shaped by interaction. Prayer mattered, memory mattered, culture mattered. Yet none of these granted control. Mortals influenced the gods collectively, slowly, and indirectly. The gods influenced mortals selectively, cautiously, and with awareness of consequence. Neither side held dominance. Both were bound. This mutual limitation is the final revelation of the pantheon's birth. The gods were not crowned in a moment of triumph. They emerged through failure, adjustment, and acceptance of law. They did not inherit creation. They learned how to exist within it. Their authority was never unlimited, and their survival depended on remembering that fact. By the time chronicles began, by the time temples rose and names were carved into stone, the pantheon was already old. Its wars had become myths. Its experiments had become rules. Its chaos had become order. What mortals call the gods are not the creators of existence. They are its custodians. And above them still, unseen and unaddressed, the law endures, silent, impartial, and absolute, ensuring that even divinity remains bound to balance. This is how the pantheon was born.